As the room rose to applaud my husband's $8.4 billion merger, his mother signaled his mistress and red wine splashed across my pregnant belly. They expected the fragile wife to flee in tears. Instead, I simply cleaned the soap and looked up at the stage. They had no idea I secretly owned the company signing his paycheck. Tonight, I would dismantle their entire world without raising my voice above a whisper. My name is Mallory Stonewell, though for the last 3 hours I have been referred to almost exclusively as Grant's wife, or even more dehumanizing, the mother-to-be. I stood near the edge of the ballroom at the Iron Crown, a venue chosen specifically because the chandeliers were imported from Austria, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city skyline that made everyone inside feel like a god looking down on the ants. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, white lees, and the distinct metallic tang of desperate ambition. Tonight was the ArcLight Gala, the crowning social event of the financial quarter. But in reality, it was a victory lap for my husband. Grant was on the verge of closing the deal of the decade, $8.4 billion. That was the number on everyone's lips. It was whispered in the coat check line, toasted to at the open bar, and murmured in the restrooms. $8.4 billion. It was enough money to buy countries, enough money to rewrite history, and certainly enough money to make a man forget that his pregnant wife was standing right next to him, her feet swollen in shoes. She did not choose. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, fighting the ache in my lower back. I was 7 months pregnant, a physical reality that felt heavy and grounding amidst the ethereal fake laughter of the party. The dress I wore was a pale, shapeless thing, a tent of seafoam green silk that managed to be both expensive and utterly unflattering. I had not picked it out. Earlier that evening, Darlene Holloway, my mother-in-law, had swept into our master bedroom while I was still in my robe. She had held the garment up with a critical sneer, as if inspecting a piece of upholstery. "Wear this one, Mallory," she had said, her voice smooth and cold, like polished marble. "The neckline is modest. You are carrying the Holloway air, not advertising for a new husband. Pregnant women should know how to stand still and look pretty. Do not distract from Grant's moment." So I stood still. I looked pretty. I played the part of the decorative vessel. Grant was holding court near the center of the room, a glass of scotch in one hand and the shoulder of a venture capitalist in the other. He looked undeniable in his $5,000 tuxedo, his smile dazzling and practiced. I watched him from 5 feet away, a distance that felt like an ocean. When a senior partner from a rival firm approached us, Grant didn't pull me into the circle. He merely gestured toward me with the hand holding the drink, a careless flick of the wrist. "And this is Mallory," Grant said, his tone dropping into that condescending register he reserved for children and service staff. "She is in full nesting mode. We try not to bore her with the dry details of acquisition strategy. She thinks a merger is just what happens when we mix our laundry right, darling." The men laughed. It was a wet, guttural sound. I forced the corners of my mouth up. "Grant is too modest," I said, my voice soft. "I just try to keep the home fires burning while he conquers the world." "Exactly," Grant said, turning his back to me to resume the conversation. Now, regarding the intellectual property valuation, I was dismissed. I was the furniture. I scanned the room, my hand resting protectively over the curve of my stomach. That was when the atmosphere shifted. The crowd parted slightly, not out of respect, but out of the magnetic pull of sheer audacity. Darlene had arrived, and she was not alone. My mother-in-law walked with the posture of a queen who had just ordered an execution. She wore black velvet, severe and elegant, but it was the woman on her arm who sucked the oxygen out of the room. Sloane Mercer. Sloane was everything I currently was not. She was razor thin, encased in a crimson gown that looked like it had been poured over her skin in liquid form. Her hair was a glossy curtain of dark silk, and her lips were painted a shade of red that matched the wine circulating on the trays. She didn't look like a guest. She looked like the prize. Darlene guided Sloane through the crowd straight toward Grant. I watched, paralyzed by a cocktail of hormones and cold, hard realization. Darlene wasn't just bringing a guest. She was bringing a replacement. "Grant, darling." Darlene's voice cut through the ambient noise. "Look who I found wandering near the Champagne Tower." Sloane was just telling me about her insights on the Asian market expansion. Grant turned and the mask of the professional businessman slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing something raw and hungry. He looked at Sloane not as a colleague, but as a starving man looks at a feast. "Sloane," Grant said, his voice dropping an octave, "I didn't think you would make it. I wouldn't miss your big night, Grant." Sloane purred. She stepped into his personal space, far closer than social etiquette allowed. Her hand, manicured to perfection, brushed against his lapel, picking off an invisible speck of dust. It was a claim, a territorial mark. I stood there, the wife, the mother of his child, less than 3 feet away, and I might as well have been invisible. They didn't even look at me. Darlene beamed at them, the proud architect of this humiliation. "You two look like a power couple," Darlene said loud enough for the circle of investors to hear. "Mallory, dear, why don't you go find a seat near the back? You look puffy. It must be exhausting standing up with all that weight." The insult landed with precision. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I didn't flinch. I had practiced my poker face for 5 years in this marriage, though I never thought the stakes would be this high. "I am fine, Darlene," I said, keeping my voice level. "Nonsense," she snapped, her smile vanishing. "Go sit down." Grant needs to discuss the North Star Meridian closing terms with Sloane. She actually understands the logistics. North Star Meridian. The name hung in the air between us. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with heartbreak and everything to do with adrenaline. They said the name with such reverence, such greed. To them, North Star Meridian was the golden goose, the mysterious tech conglomerate that had agreed to buy Grant's hollowed-out logistics empire for $8.4 billion. They thought they were fleecing a faceless corporation. I took a sip of sparkling water to hide the sudden dryness in my throat. If they only knew who had signed the initial intent letter. If they only knew whose trust fund was the majority shareholder of the holding company that owned North Star. Ladies and gentlemen, the voice of the master of ceremonies boomed over the speakers, causing the crystal glasses on the tables to vibrate. "Please take your seats. We are moments away from the keynote address celebrating the strategic partnership between Holloway Holdings and North Star Meridian." The room erupted in applause. Grant offered his arm to Sloane. I froze. He was supposed to walk his wife to the table. Instead, he was escorting his mistress with his mother trailing behind them like a chaperone from hell. I walked alone. I found my seat at table 12, the family table. Though I felt less like family and more like a poor relation they couldn't legally disown. As I sat, the heavy linen napkin felt rough against my fingers. I slid my hand under the table and pulled out my phone. It was set to silent. The screen dimmed to the lowest setting. There was a new message from a number I didn't save, though I knew exactly who it was. It was from the private investigator I had hired 6 months ago, a man who charged $500 an hour and was worth every penny. The text was short. "If they play dirty tonight, you only need to nod. Everything is ready. The file is live." I stared at the glowing pixels. The file, the digital smoking gun that would prove Grant had inflated his user numbers by 40% and hidden $300 million in debt in offshore shell companies. The due diligence team at North Star, my team, had found it all. But we had waited. We had waited for this exact moment when the lights were brightest and the fall would be hardest. I looked up. Darlene had circled back to the table. She leaned down, her face close to mine. Up close, I could see the heavy foundations settling into the fine lines around her mouth. She smelled of violets and cruelty. "Don't look so dare, Mallory," she whispered, her voice a hiss meant only for me. "Grant deserves a partner who shines tonight. Since you insist on looking like a swollen, heavy bag, the least you can do is stay out of the photographs. Tonight, you should learn to endure. That is what a good wife does. She endures silence." She pulled back, expecting to see tears. She expected to see the girl from the wrong side of the tracks, who was grateful just to be in the room. Instead, I looked her dead in the eye. I felt the cool metal of the phone in my hand under the table. I thought about the $8.4 billion. I thought about the text message and I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It wasn't the smile of a wife or a mother. It was the smile of a CEO who had just decided to liquidate a failing asset. Endurance is an overrated virtue. Darlene, I said, my voice steady. Sometimes a wife doesn't need to endure. Sometimes she just needs to execute. Darlene frowned, confusion flickering in her eyes for a brief second before she dismissed me with a scoff and turned back to watch her son on stage. She didn't understand. She thought I was speaking in metaphors. She had no idea that the execution had already been scheduled. The transition from the ballroom to the private executive lounge was like stepping from a chaotic theater into the quiet, sterile air of a bank vault. The noise of the orchestra faded into a dull thrum against the heavy oak doors, replaced by the clinking of ice and crystal tumblers and the low murmuring baritone of men discussing money. This was where the real party happened. The ballroom was for the peacocks. The lounge was for the predators. I trailed behind Grant, keeping a respectful 2 paces back, exactly where he preferred me. He was flanked by his CFO and 2 senior partners from the venture capital firm backing the deal. They moved in a phalanx, a wall of black tuxedos and arrogance, while I waddled slightly in their wake, my hand resting on my lower back to alleviate the constant dull ache of the 3rd trimester. Grant guided the group toward a cluster of leather armchairs near the fireplace. He loosened his bow tie slightly, a gesture that signaled he was among friends, or at least among accomplices. It took 6 months of grinding them down, Grant said, dropping into a chair and swirling his scotch. But Northstar Meridian finally caved. Honestly, $8.4 billion is a steal for what we are getting. We stripped them clean on the IP valuation. They didn't even fight back on the retention clauses. I stood near the edge of the circle, feigning interest in a painting of a hunt scene on the wall. I let out a soft, non-committal sound. R.A. said. It was a syllable devoid of intelligence, the kind of noise a pet makes when it wants to be acknowledged but not heard. Grant didn't even look at me. He just smirked at his CFO. Mallory doesn't bore herself with the details. She thinks retention has something to do with water weight. The men chuckled. It was a dry, scratching sound. I kept my face perfectly smooth, a mask of benign confusion. Inside, however, my mind was racing through the term sheet. I had drafted myself 3 weeks ago under my maiden name's trust. They thought Northstar Meridian had caved. No, Northstar had opened the door and invited them into the slaughterhouse. The concessions Grant was bragging about were actually carefully laid traps. The retention clauses he mentioned were designed to bind him to the company just long enough for the forensic accountants to dismantle him legally. He wasn't stripping us clean. He was handcuffing himself to a sinking ship. It was almost funny. Almost. I remembered the early days of our marriage back when I still thought we were partners. I used to try to talk to him about his business. I had a degree in economics. After all, I had graduated top of my class. But every time I offered an insight or asked a question about a PL statement, Grant would sigh. That long-suffering exhale of a parent dealing with a slow child. "Sweetheart," he would say, handing me a paperback romance novel or a fashion magazine. "Don't worry your pretty little head about the hard numbers. Why don't you go read your stories? Leave the heavy lifting to the men." Over the years, I learned to play the role. I became the woman who only read fiction. I became the woman who nodded and smiled and asked if the stock market was up or down like it was a weather report. I let them underestimate me because there is no better camouflage in the world than a man's own ego. "Mrs. Holloway." A voice cut through my reverie. I turned. It was Mr. Sterling, a potential investor from New York who hadn't been fully briefed on the ignore the wife protocol. He looked at me with genuine curiosity. "I don't think I have had the pleasure of asking what line of work were you in before tonight." I opened my mouth to answer, perhaps to mention my background in data analytics, but the air was suddenly sucked out of the conversation. "Oh, Mallory is a domestic goddess these days." Darlene's voice sliced in from the left. My mother-in-law had followed us into the lounge, bringing the scent of heavy floral perfume and judgment with her. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her fingers digging in just hard enough to be painful disguised as affection. "The poor dear," Darlene continued, smiling at Mr. Sterling while her eyes bored into me. "She stays home. Pregnancy limits her so much. You know, She barely has the energy to manage the flower arrangements, let alone a career. We just want her to focus on being a vessel for the baby. A vessel, not a mother, not a person, a container. Mr. Sterling looked uncomfortable, but he nodded. I see. Very noble work. Grant needs a peaceful home to return to, Darlene added, turning her back to me to address the group, especially with the stress of the merger. Slow has been such a help in that regard, keeping the logistics running while Mallory rests. At the mention of her name, Sloane Mercer materialized from the shadows of the lounge like she had been summoned. She walked straight to Grant's chair and perched on the armrest. It was a violation of business etiquette, so flagrant it had to be intentional. She wasn't just his assistant or his consultant. She was marking him. I just got off the phone with the legal team in Singapore, Sloane said, her voice low and husky. She leaned down, whispering something into Grant's ear that made him smile. I watched them. I watched the way Grant's body leaned into hers. I watched the way her hand rested on the back of his neck, her thumb tracing the hairline. It wasn't the fumbling intimacy of a drunk mistake. It was practiced. It was comfortable. They had done this 100 times before. They looked like a couple who had built a life together on the foundation of my humiliation. My throat felt tight as if I had swallowed a handful of dry ash. I am going to get some water, I murmured. No one answered. No one even turned their head. I was dismissed. I walked over to the hydration station in the corner, my movement slow and heavy. I poured a glass of water, my hand trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the sheer effort of holding back the rage that wanted to scream through my teeth. I took a sip, letting the cold liquid ground me. My phone buzzed against my thigh. I pulled it out, shielding the screen with my clutch. The caller ID read, "Dear Aris, Objan, Grant, Darlene, and Sloane were too busy laughing at a joke about hostile takeovers to notice me." I slid my thumb across the screen to answer, lifting the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, injecting a note of worry into my voice. "Mrs. Stonewell." A woman's voice answered. It wasn't my doctor. It was the head of my private security detail, a woman named Jericho who specialized in corporate extraction. "The package has been delivered. It is waiting for you in the VIP suite on the 4th floor. Access code is 4912. You have a 10-minute window before the next security rotation. Is everything okay with the baby?" I asked loud enough for Mr. Sterling to hear, my brow furrowing in fake distress. "The documents are original copies," Jericho continued, ignoring my acting, "and we secured the audio recording from the dinner rehearsal. It is damning. You are cleared to proceed." "I understand," I said, my voice trembling. "I will go sit down for a moment. Thank you, doctor." I hung up and took a shaky breath. I turned back to the group. Grant was lighting a cigar now, looking like the king of the world. "Grant," I said, stepping into the circle. "The doctor just called. My blood pressure is a little elevated. I'm feeling very lightheaded. I think I need to go to the medical room for a moment to lie down." Grant looked annoyed, the cigar smoke curling around his face. "Now, Mallory, the signing ceremony is in 40 minutes. It will just take a moment," I said, putting a hand to my forehead. Darlene scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Honestly, Mallory, you always have to make it about you, don't you? Even on the biggest night of Grant's life. Go on, then go lie down. Try not to ruin the schedule." She smirked at Sloane, a conspiratorial look that said, "See, she is weak. She is broken." "I will be back," I whispered. I turned and walked out of the lounge. As soon as the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, the sway in my step vanished. I didn't head for the medical room. I headed for the service elevator. The hallway was empty, lined with plush carpet that muffled my footsteps. I reached a quiet alcove near the elevators and stopped. I leaned against the wall and bent down to unbuckle the straps of my heels. My feet were swollen, throbbing in protest, but the pain felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. I slipped the shoes off. Holding them in one hand, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, filling my lungs until they pressed against my ribs. 1, 2, 3, I placed my free hand on my stomach. The baby kicked a strong rhythmic thump against my palm. "We are okay," I whispered to the darkness. "We are on beat." They thought I was leaving the stage, because I couldn't handle the spotlight. They didn't realize I was just going backstage to change the script. I walked barefoot down the corridor toward the VIP suite, the cold marble floor biting into my skin. It felt good. It felt real. When I reached the door marked private, I punched in the code 4912. The lock clicked with a satisfying mechanical thud. I pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, smelling of ozone and expensive leather. Standing by the window, silhouetted against the city lights, was a man in a gray suit. He didn't turn around when I entered. He simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He turned then. His face was nondescript, the kind of face you forget 5 seconds after seeing it. That was why he was the best. "Mrs. Stonewell," he said, his voice flat and professional. He held the envelope out to me. "This is the final term sheet. It includes the hidden addendums regarding the debt transfer." I took the envelope. It felt heavy in my hand. He paused, then added the detail that made my pulse spike. "And it has the draft signature your husband authorized 20 minutes ago," he said. He didn't read page 42. I looked down at the envelope. Page 42, the page where Grant Holloway had unknowingly signed away his entire legacy to a shell company controlled by the wife he thought was too stupid to read a balance sheet. "Thank you," I said. "Good luck, ma'am." He nodded, and then he slipped out a side door, vanishing like smoke. I stood alone in the room, clutching the paper that would destroy my marriage. I didn't feel sad. I felt sharp. I felt ready. I slipped the documents into my oversized clutch, right next to the ultrasound photo I kept for courage. Then I put my heels back on. It was time to go back to the party. It was time to let them pour the wine. I slid the term sheet out of the envelope, the paper crisp and cool against my fingertips in the silence of the VIP suite. The rustle of the pages sounded like the cocking of a gun. I did not read it like a wife looking for her husband's name. I read it like the forensic analyst I used to be before Grant decided I was better suited for flower arranging. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of legalese, skipping over the standard boilerplate and zeroing in on the financial structuring clauses. It was masterful in a corrupt sort of way. Grant and his team had constructed a labyrinth of debt restructuring and risk transfer protocols designed to look like standard asset acquisition. But I saw the cracks on page 12 under the section labeled liability assumption. Grant had inserted a clause that effectively transferred $300 million of toxic debt from Holloway Holdings into the post-merger entity. He was dumping his failures onto Northstar Meridian. I turned the page under revenue projections. The numbers were purely fantastical. He had listed a projected fourth-quarter growth of 18% based on contracts that I knew for a fact did not exist. He was selling a hollow shell and pricing it like a gold mine. It was not just optimistic accounting. It was fraud. It was a lie worth $8.4 billion. Then I reached the addendum, the page the courier had specifically mentioned. It was a single sheet attached to the back titled "Beneficial Owner Approval Required." In any major acquisition involving a private equity firm like Northstar Meridian, the ultimate authority did not rest with the CEO, but with the beneficial owner, the person who actually held the equity. Usually this name was buried under layers of LLCs and trusts to protect privacy. Here, the name was redacted, replaced by a code, Trust Entity 79 Alpha. I ran my thumb over the code. A ghost of a smile touched my lips. Grant had seen this code a dozen times during the negotiations. He assumed it belonged to some reclusive billionaire in Geneva or a faceless pension fund in Singapore. He had no idea that Trust Entity 79 Alpha was a revocable living trust established in the state of Delaware exactly 7 years ago. I closed my eyes for a second, the memory washing over me. It was 2 weeks before our wedding. My grandmother, a woman who made her fortune in semiconductor patents and trusted no one, had sat me down in her library. "Mallory," she had said, her voice raspy from decades of smoking, "you love this man. I can see that. But love is a chemical reaction. Marriage is a contract, and contracts need insurance." She had made me sign the papers that effectively placed her entire portfolio, including the controlling interest in a small aggressive investment firm called Northstar, into a trust in my name. The condition was simple. The assets were mine, but they were to remain silent until I needed them. Grant knew I came from comfortable money, but he thought it was old, stagnant money. He thought my inheritance was a vacation home in the Hamptons and a vintage Mercedes. He didn't know I owned the very hand that was currently feeding him. I opened my eyes. The reality of the situation crystallized in my mind. Grant wasn't just trying to cheat a business partner. He was trying to defraud his own wife. He thought Northstar Meridian was his prey, a foolish company with too much cash and not enough due diligence. He thought he was the shark. He didn't realize he was swimming in my tank. I pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted messaging app I used to communicate with my legal team. I typed a message to Tessa Hart. Tessa was not just a divorce lawyer. She was a shark in a Chanel suit who specialized in complex financial litigation and white-collar crime. I have the term sheet. I typed, he is pushing the debt transfer and the inflated revenue projections. He is going to sign the warranty of solvency knowing it is false. 3 seconds later, 3 dots appeared and vanished. As Tessa replied, if he signs that document with those figures included, he is crossing the line from civil breach of contract into securities fraud. He is soliciting investment based on materially false information. And since Northstar is the buyer, he is defrauding you directly. Do we intervene? I tapped the screen, my rhythm steady. No intervention yet. Let him sign. I need the signature to prove intent. If we stop him now, it is just a mistake. If he signs, it is a felony. Understood, Tessa replied. We are ready to file the moment ink heads. The SEC complaint is drafted. The freezing orders are ready for the judge. Be careful, Mel. Once this starts, there is no going back. I am not going back. I typed I am going through. I locked the phone and slipped it back into my clutch. I took the term sheet, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the interior pocket of my blazer, right next to my heart. It felt like carrying a grenade with the pin pulled out. I walked over to the mirror in the suite. I looked at myself. The seafoam dress was still hideous, but the woman wearing it looked different. My eyes were clear. The fatigue was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the judge, the jury, and in about 20 minutes I would be the executioner. I left the suite and walked back down the corridor toward the ballroom. The hallway was lined with mirrors and fresh flowers, the air humming with the distant sound of a string quartet. As I turned the corner near the restrooms, I heard a laugh. It was a high tinkling sound, like breaking glass. Sloane Mercer was standing near the entrance to the ladies' lounge, touching up her lipstick in a hallway mirror, while Darlene stood nearby, adjusting the strap of her velvet gown. They didn't see me at first. God, did you see her face when Grant told her to go lie down? Sloane said, capping her lipstick. She looked like a kicked puppy. I almost felt bad. Almost. Darlene chuckled. Do not waste your pity, Sloane. Mallory is useful in her own way. She plays the role of the saintly, suffering wife perfectly. It makes Grant look like a benevolent provider. Besides, once the baby is born, we will hire a night nurse and Mallory can go back to whatever it is she does, reading magazines and spending Grant's money. I just hope she doesn't cry on stage, Sloane said, checking her teeth in the mirror. That dress is tragic enough without tear stains. And honestly, that belly, it is so convenient, isn't it? A perfect prop to garner sympathy when she inevitably gets sidelined. She knows her place, Darlene said dismissively. Or she will by the end of tonight. I stopped walking. I stood in the shadow of a large potted palm, watching them. They were discussing my life, my body, and my child, as if I were a minor inconvenience to be managed, a hurdle to be cleared on their way to the bank. I could have stepped out then. I could have screamed. I could have thrown a vase. But that is what the old Mallory would have done. The emotional, hormonal, weak Mallory they thought they knew. Instead, I took a breath. I smoothed the fabric of my dress over my stomach, convenient for crying, Sloane had said. I stepped out from the shadows. I walked straight down the center of the hallway, my heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm on the marble floor. Darlene saw me first. Her eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. Sloane spun around, a flash of guilt crossing her face before she plastered on that saccharine smile. Mallory, Sloane exclaimed, her voice dripping with fake concern. "We were just wondering if you were okay. Did you have a nice rest?" I didn't stop walking. I didn't smile. I didn't even blink. I looked at Sloane, my gaze raking over her expensive red dress, her perfectly coiffed hair, her smug sense of victory. The rest was enlightening. "Thank you," I said. My voice was low, devoid of any warmth. I walked right past them. As I passed Sloane, I paused for a fraction of a second. "You have lipstick on your teeth." "Sloane," I said. Sloane's hand flew to her mouth in panic. I didn't wait for a response. I kept walking. As I moved away, I reached down to my right wrist. I wore a chunky gold cuff bracelet, the kind that looked like a piece of modern art. Derlin had called it gaudy when I bought it. I ran my finger along the inside rim of the bracelet until I felt the tiny recessed groove. I pressed it. A microscopic blue light pulsed once, confirming the connection. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a high-capacity solid-state drive containing every email, every text message, and every financial record I had intercepted over the last 6 months. It was connected wirelessly to the main server in the ballroom control room where my private team had already infiltrated the AV system. I was literally wearing the evidence. I reached the heavy double doors of the ballroom. The noise of the party swelled, a roar of conversation and clinking glasses. Just as the ushers reached to open the doors for me, the music cut out. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, leaving only the spotlight sweeping across the crowd. The master of ceremonies' voice boomed over the sound system, echoing off the high ceilings. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. The moment we have all been waiting for has arrived. In just a few minutes, we will witness the historic signing ceremony that will reshape the landscape of global logistics. Please welcome back to the stage the architect of the 8.4 billion future, Mr. Grant Holloway." The crowd erupted. Thunderous applause shook the floorboards. I stepped into the room. The darkness was comforting. I watched Grant bound up the stairs to the stage, bathing in the adoration, waving to the crowd like a conquering hero. He looked invincible. I stood at the back of the room, a small figure in a seafoam dress, clutching a clutch bag that held his death warrant. "Go ahead, Grant," I thought, watching him take the microphone. "Take your bow, because the curtain is about to come down so hard it will shatter the floor." I began to make my way through the crowd, moving toward table 12. The timeline was set. The players were in position, and I was done waiting. The spotlight cut through the darkness of the ballroom, a solid beam of white heat that pinned my husband to the center of the stage. He stood behind a lucite podium that gleamed under the lights, looking every inch the titan of industry he believed himself to be. The applause was a physical weight in the room, a rolling thunder of validation that seemed to feed him. Grant soaked it in, his chest expanding, his smile practiced and dazzling. I stood in the shadows near table 12, my hand resting absently on the side of my stomach. From this angle, I was invisible. I was the backstage crew, the extra in the movie of his life. "Integrity," Grant said into the microphone, his voice booming with a rich, resonant timbre that sounded convincingly earnest. "That is the foundation of Holloway Holdings. When we approached this merger, we didn't just look at the numbers. We looked at the soul of the business. We looked for a partner who shared our commitment to transparency and ethical growth." The irony was so sharp it almost drew blood. I watched him speak about ethics while the term sheet in my blazer pocket burned against my ribs, a document that proved he was willing to defraud investors and bury $300 million in toxic debt to save his own skin. He was preaching about transparency while actively hiding his mistress in the front row. I shifted my gaze to that front row. It was a masterclass in social exclusion. Darlene was seated right at the edge of the stage, the prime spot usually reserved for the spouse. But she wasn't alone. She had linked her arm through Sloane's, pulling the younger woman close in a display of intimacy that was impossible to miss. They sat with their heads inclined toward each other, whispering and nodding at Grant's speech. Darlene was beaming, casting proud looks at Sloane as if to say, "This is the future. This is the woman who belongs here." To the casual observer, they looked like the family unit, the mother, the son, and the partner. I was the anomaly. I was the swollen, uncomfortable variable that had been factored out of the equation. And tonight, Grant continued, gesturing grandly to the wings of the stage, we are not just signing a contract. We are forging a destiny. Please welcome the CEO of our new family, the man leading Northstar Meridian, Mr. Calder Voss. The orchestra swelled. Calder walked onto the stage. Calder Voss was a man cast from steel and old money. He was tall, silver-haired, and possessed a stillness that made Grant's energetic bouncing look childish. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than Grant's car, but he wore it as if it were pajamas. He was the perfect frontman. The world thought he was the mastermind behind Northstar Meridian. They thought he was the shark who had built the conglomerate from nothing. Only 3 people in the world knew the truth. Calder was an employee. He was a brilliant executive. Yes, but he answered to a board of 1. He answered to me. Calder crossed the stage and shook Grant's hand. The grip lasted a second longer than necessary. Grant pumped his hand enthusiastically, leaning into the microphone to share the moment. Calder, Grant said, beaming, it is an honor to finally make this official. The $8.4 billion handshake. Calder stepped to the microphone. He didn't smile. He looked out at the audience, his gaze sweeping over the hundreds of faces, the bankers, the lawyers, the sycophants. Then his eyes found the shadows near table 12. He locked eyes with me for a fraction of a second. It was imperceptible to anyone else, but to me it was a salute. Thank you, Grant, Calder said, his voice cool and smooth. Northstar Meridian is a company built on precision. We value accurate ownership. Tonight is not just about a merger. Tonight is the night of the true owner. The crowd applauded politely, thinking it was a metaphorical nod to the shareholders. Grant laughed, a loud barking sound. He slapped Calder on the back. The true owner. I like that. That's me. Right, or as I should say. Grant missed the cue entirely. He was so blinded by his own reflection in the trophy that he didn't see the blade coming for his neck. He thought Calder was complimenting him. He didn't realize he was being read his rights. My phone buzzed against my hip. I glanced down, shielding the screen with my hand. Audio feed at table 12 is live, crystal clear. We are recording. Green light. The trap was primed. On stage, a team of assistants brought out a table covered in blue velvet. On it lay a leather-bound document holder. This was the ceremonial signing. In high-stakes mergers, the real contracts are often signed in back rooms by lawyers, but the public needs a show. Grant insisted on this moment. He wanted the photo op of the pen hitting the paper. Grant picked up the heavy gold-plated pen. He looked out at the audience, pausing for effect. Flashbulbs erupted like a lightning storm. To the future, Grant shouted. He bent down and signed his name with a flourish. The room exploded in cheers. People stood up. Champagne corks popped in the distance. Darlene was clapping so hard her bracelets rattled. Sloane was looking at Grant with a gaze that simulated adoration perfectly. But I remained still. I watched the ink dry on the page projected onto the giant screens behind them. I knew exactly what that document was. It was a simplified memorandum of understanding. It referenced the main contract, the contract that was currently sitting in the VIP suite, signed by Grant, but missing the one thing that made it legal. It was missing the signature of the beneficial owner without my signature. Grant had just publicly committed to a deal he didn't have the authority to close. He was celebrating a sale that hadn't happened. He was spending money he didn't have. Every clap of the audience was another nail in his legal coffin. Darling stood up. Then she didn't look at the stage. She turned and looked directly at me. Across the room, our eyes met. Her expression shifted. The mask of the benevolent matriarch slipped, replaced by the cold, calculating look of a woman who is tired of loose ends. She gave a microscopic nod. It wasn't directed at me. It was directed to someone standing in the periphery. A waiter near the bar moved. Then I saw Sloane stand up. Sloane smoothed the front of her red dress. She picked up a full glass of red wine from the table, a heavy, expensive Cabernet that looked black in the dim light. She didn't look at Grant anymore. She looked at me. Her walk was predatory. She moved through the tables with a fluid, deliberate grace, navigating the gap between the VIP section and the outskirts where I had been banished. She wasn't rushing. She wanted this to be seen. She wanted the audience to witness the interaction. I saw the setup instantly. Darlene wanted a scene. She wanted the pregnant wife to look unstable, emotional, or perhaps clumsy. A wine spill would cause a commotion. I would be wet, stained, humiliated. I would have to leave to change clothes, removing me from the room entirely before the real business began. It was a tactic to erase me from the finale. Sloane approached table 12. The people nearby fell silent, sensing the shift in energy. They watched the mistress approach the wife, their eyes wide with the voyeuristic thrill of a scandal unfolding in real time. I didn't back away. I stood my ground, my feet planted firmly on the carpet. I kept my hands relaxed at my sides, though every muscle in my body was coiled tight. Sloane stopped 2 feet away from me. She smiled. It was a terrible, beautiful smile. Up close, I could smell the wine in her glass and the heavy musk of her perfume. "Mallory," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables. "You look so lonely back here in the dark. Grant is doing so well, isn't he?" "He is certainly putting on a show," I replied, my voice calm. Sloane took a step closer, invading my personal space. She swirled the wine in her glass. The dark liquid lapped dangerously close to the rim. "You know," Sloane purred, leaning in as if to share a secret. "Darling thinks you should go home. You look tired. And honestly, this world is a bit much for you, isn't it? The numbers, the pressure." She let her eyes drift down to my stomach, then back up to my face. Her gaze was dismissive, stripping me of any value other than biological utility. "Don't worry, sweetie," she whispered, the cruelty finally naked in her tone. "I will take good care of him tonight. I know exactly what he needs to celebrate. You just focus on waiting." She shifted her weight. I saw her wrist turn. It wasn't an accident. It was a calculated mechanical movement. She was going to trip or pretend to trip. She was going to launch the wine forward. I barely had time to tense my abdominal muscles. Sloane feigned a stumble. "Oh," she cried out, theatrically fake. The glass tilted. Gravity took over. The dark red wave crested over the rim, aimed directly at the seafoam silk covering my unborn child. The room seemed to hold its breath. The flash bulbs from the stage were still popping in the distance, capturing Grant's triumph, while down here in the dark, his women were at war. But Sloane had made a critical error. She thought she was throwing wine on a victim. She didn't realize she was baptizing a nemesis. The liquid left the glass. The sensation was immediate and shocking. A sudden icy deluge that soaked through the thin silk of my dress and plastered the fabric to my skin. The dark Cabernet did not just splash. It drenched. It spread across the swell of my stomach like a jagged expanding wound, turning the pale seafoam green into a muddy, violent purple. The smell hit me a second later, the heavy cloying scent of oak and fermented grapes, an aroma that usually signaled celebration now reeking of humiliation. For a heartbeat, the entire ballroom went silent. The applause died in throats replaced by a collective, sharp intake of breath. A few guests at the nearby table stood up instinctively, their napkins clutched in their hands, eyes wide with the primal social horror of witnessing a public disaster. I looked down at myself. The wine was dripping from the curve of my belly onto the floor, splattering on the polished tips of my shoes. I could feel the cold liquid trickling down my legs. It was grotesque. It was degrading. It was exactly what they wanted. "Oh my God!" Sloane shrieked. Her voice was pitched high, trembling with a performance of distress that would have embarrassed a daytime soap opera actress. She brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. "I am so clumsy I tripped. I am so sorry, Mallory." I looked up from the stain to her face. The panic in her eyes was theatrical, but the set of her mouth told a different story. The corners of her lips were twitching upward, fighting back a smirk of absolute triumph. She had done it. She had marked her territory. She had turned the wife into a mess, a stain to be wiped away so the real party could continue. "Look at what you have done," Darlene said. She didn't look at Sloane. She looked at me. Her voice was not loud, but it carried the cutting precision of a scalpel. She stared at my ruined dress with a look of utter revulsion, as if the wine were a manifestation of my own incompetence. "I told you," Darlene continued, stepping closer so only the immediate circle could hear the venom. "Pregnant women should stay at home. You are clumsy. You take up too much space. Now look at you. You are an eyesore. You are ruining the aesthetic of Grant's night. She didn't offer a napkin. She didn't ask if the baby was okay. She looked at me like I was a dog that had soiled the carpet. Mother. Grant's voice cut in. He had come down from the stage. I hadn't even seen him move. He pushed through the small circle of gawking onlookers. His face flushed, not with concern, but with irritation. He looked at Sloane, then at his mother, and finally at me. His eyes lingered on the stain for less than a second before snapping to my face. There was no love in his gaze. There was no husband there. There was only a PR manager doing damage control. Jesus, Mallory, Grant hissed, gripping my upper arm. His fingers dug into my flesh, hard enough to bruise. Can you not go 5 minutes without causing a scene? We have investors from Tokyo watching. She poured wine on me. Grant, I said. My voice was calm. It sounded strange to my own ears, detached and hollow, like it was coming from a speaker across the room. It was an accident, Grant snapped, dismissing me. He looked around at the staring guests and forced a tight, charming smile. Everything is fine. Everyone just a little spill. My wife is a bit unsteady these days. The nesting instinct makes her clumsy. A ripple of polite, uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. They bought it. Or rather, they chose to buy it because it was easier than confronting the cruelty they were witnessing. Grant turned back to me, his smile vanishing instantly. Go upstairs, he ordered, his voice low and dangerous. Go to the suite and clean yourself up. Do not come back down until you look presentable. Or better yet, just stay up there. I will tell them you were tired. He pushed me. It was a small shove, disguised as a guiding hand, but the intent was clear. Get out. You are unwanted. Sloane stepped forward, placing a hand on Grant's other arm, staking her claim. I will help you handle things down here. Grant, she said softly. Though Mallory, you look like you need to cry. I looked at the three of them, the mother, the son, and the mistress, an unholy trinity of narcissism. They expected me to burst into tears. They expected me to run away, humiliated and broken, to hide in the hotel room until the morning. They thought the wine had stripped me of my dignity. They were wrong. The wine had not stripped me of anything. It had washed away the last lingering pretense of my marriage. I did not cry. I did not shake. I reached down and picked up a silk napkin from the table. I moved with slow, deliberate motions. I dabbed at the worst of the spill on my stomach, not to clean it, but to acknowledge it. Then I dropped the stained napkin on the floor at Grant's feet. Is there a medical room? I asked. My voice was not loud, but it had changed. The softness was gone. It was flat, hard, and devoid of inflection. It was the voice of a judge passing a sentence. Grant blinked, taken aback by the lack of emotion. Ah, you are fine. It is just wine. I took a direct impact to the abdomen, I stated, locking eyes with him. I want a medical professional to document that the fetus is not in distress. Now, the word document hung in the air. Grant stiffened. He knew that word. It was a legal word. Fine, he muttered, waving a hand at a passing staff member. Get the on-site medic, check her out, then get her out of my sight. I followed the staff member away from the table. I did not look back. I could feel their eyes on me, Grant's annoyance, Sloane's victory, Darlene's disgust. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully exiled the problem. 10 minutes later, I was sitting on an examination table in the small medical office adjacent to the ballroom. The bright fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a stark contrast to the dim romantic lighting of the gala. The nurse, a kind woman named Sarah, who looked genuinely concerned, finished checking the fetal heart rate. The heartbeat is strong, Mrs. Holloway, she said, removing the monitor. 140 beats per minute. Perfect. The liquid was just room temperature, so no thermal shock. Physically, you and the baby are absolutely fine. But she hesitated, looking at the ruined dress. Emotionally, that was quite a shock. Do you want a sedative? Something mild. I swung my legs off the table and stood up. I looked at myself in the mirror on the wall. The stain had dried into a stiff, dark crust. I looked like a casualty of war. No, I said, I don't need a sedative. I need to change. There is a dressing room right through there, Sarah said, pointing to a side door. Take your time. Thank you, I said. write in the report that the mother was calm and alert. Mark the time. Okay, she said, looking confused. I will. But I walked into the dressing room and locked the door. It was a small space lined with mirrors. I was alone. The first thing I did was take out my phone. I opened the secure app again. My finger hovered over the execute button. This was the nuclear option. Once I pressed this, there was no returning to the life I had known. The Hello name would be mud. Brent would be ruined. Darlene would be a pariah. And I would be the woman who burned it all down. I thought about the wine soaking into my skin. I thought about Grant pushing me away. I thought about my child growing inside me, and whether I wanted him to be raised by a father who treated people like disposables. I pressed execute. The screen flashed green. Batch 1 sent, major investors list. Batch 2 sent, industry press contacts. Batch 3 sent, whistleblower portal. It was done. The emails were flying through the digital ether carrying attachments that detailed the shell companies, the inflated user metrics, and the debt-hiding schemes. Within 10 minutes, every BlackBerry and iPhone in the ballroom would start buzzing. But I wasn't done. I unzipped the ruined seafoam dress. It fell to the floor in a heavy, wet heap. I stepped out of it and kicked it into the corner. I stripped off the undergarments that had been stained. Hanging on the back of the door in a garment bag I had arranged to be placed there 3 hours ago by my security team was my backup plan. I unzipped the bag. It wasn't a maternity dress. It was a custom-tailored black architectural gown made of structural silk and neoprene. It had sharp lines, a high neck, and a cape-like back that added drama and authority. It was severe. It was powerful. It was the kind of dress a widow wears to the funeral of a husband she killed. I pulled it on. It fit perfectly, accommodating the baby bump without hiding it, turning my silhouette into something formidable. I looked at myself in the mirror. The soft pregnant wife was gone. In her place stood the majority shareholder. I reached into the pocket of the garment bag and pulled out a small wireless lavalier microphone. I clipped it to the underside of the high collar, hidden from view, but perfectly positioned to capture my voice. I tapped it once. A faint static sound confirmed it was live, connected directly to the ballroom's main sound system, overriding the handheld mics. I checked my makeup. I applied a fresh coat of dark red lipstick, a shade that matched the wine stains on the floor, but on my lips it looked like war paint. I took a deep breath. My heart was beating slow and steady. The fear was gone. The sadness was gone. There was only the cold, hard clarity of purpose. I opened the dressing room door and walked past the stunned nurse. "Mrs. Holloway," she asked, "where are you going?" "Mrs. Holloway is gone," I said without stopping. "I am going to work." I walked down the corridor leading back to the ballroom. The sounds of the party grew louder. I could hear the murmur of the crowd, the clinking of glasses. They were relaxed now. They thought the drama was over. They thought the disruption had been removed. As I reached the heavy double doors, I heard the master of ceremony speak again. His voice was jovial, unaware of the digital bomb that had just detonated in everyone's inbox. And now, the MC announced, while we wait for the final verification of the documents, we have a special surprise. Grant has asked for a few words from the person who supports him most. Although she had to step away for a moment, I believe she is returning. Please welcome Mrs. Lalaurie Holloway back to the stage to share a few words about her brilliant husband. It was a setup. Grant hadn't asked for this. Burley must have whispered in the MC's ear, setting me up for another round of humiliation, expecting me to be absent or to come back looking disheveled and terrory. They wanted to highlight my absence or my weakness. I signaled the usher to open the doors. The heavy wood swung outward. The lights of the ballroom hit me. I didn't flinch. I walked into the room, not as the wife who had been sent to her room, but as the owner coming to inspect her property. The silence that fell over the room this time was different. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of fear. I walked toward the stage. The walk from the back of the ballroom to the stage was a journey of 50 yards, but it felt like crossing a border between two warring nations. The silence in the room was absolute. The clinking of silverware had stopped. The whispers had died. The only sound was the rhythmic percussive strike of my heels against the floorboards. I could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. 5 minutes ago I had been the pitiful stained creature scurrying away in shame. Now I was returning in a black architectural gown that cost more than Darlene's car, walking with a spine of steel. The guests parted for me, their eyes tracking the sharp lines of my silhouette. I saw confusion in their faces. They were trying to reconcile the weeping willow they thought they knew with the oak tree standing before them. I reached the stairs to the stage. Grant was standing at the podium, his hand frozen halfway through a gesture. His smile, usually so elastic and reliable, had stiffened into a rickness of panic. He looked at my dress, then at my face, and I saw the question burning in his eyes. "Who are you?" He stepped back as I ascended the final step, his microphone dipping slightly. "Mallory," he hissed, his voice low enough that only the front row could hear. "What are you doing? I told you to stay upstairs. You are ruining the flow." I didn't look at him. I walked past him, entering the halo of the spotlight. It was blindingly hot, a physical weight of attention, but I found it clarifying. I stepped up to the podium. Grant made a move to grab my elbow, a subtle attempt to steer me away, but I shifted my weight, putting the lucite stand between us. I looked down at the teleprompter screen embedded in the floor. The script Darlene had approved was scrolling in bright white letters. "I am so incredibly lucky to stand beside a visionary like Grant. While he conquers the world of finance, I am just happy to keep his home warm. Thank you, darling, for giving me a life I could never have dreamed of on my own." It was a suicide note for my dignity. It was a script designed to reduce me to a cheerleader, a beneficiary of his greatness. I looked up. I looked directly into the camera lens broadcasting to the giant screens behind me. Then I looked at Darlene. She was sitting rigid in her chair, her face a mask of furious confusion. Sloane was next to her, clutching her wine glass so hard her knuckles were white. I reached up and adjusted the microphone. I didn't need the podium mic. The lavalier on my collar was hot, but the gesture commanded the room. "Look," I said. My voice was deeper than usual, stripped of the breathy, high-pitched tone I had used for years to appease Grant's ego. It resonated through the ballroom speakers with crystal clarity. "That is a funny word, isn't it? The script here says I should thank my husband for his vision. It says I should tell you how lucky I am to be kept." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the crowd. Grant took a half step toward me, his eyes wide. "But I have been thinking a lot about marriage tonight," I continued, ignoring him. "I have been thinking about the nature of partnership. We are taught that behind every great man is a woman. Usually she is standing in his shadow. Sometimes she is standing in a puddle of red wine." The laughter died instantly. I heard a gasp from somewhere near table 6. Sloane flinched as if I had thrown a stone at her. "But a true partnership," I said, leaning forward, "is not about shadows. It is about light. It is about transparency. It is about knowing exactly what is being signed in your name." I turned my head slightly, catching Grant's profile. He was sweating. A single bead of perspiration was tracking down his temple. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a dry cough. "Mallory, honey," Grant said, leaning into his own mic, trying to wrestle back control. "I think the pregnancy hormones are making us a little philosophical tonight. Let's get to the toast, shall we?" "Oh, I am not done, Grant," I said. I didn't shout. I didn't have to. The quiet authority in my voice stopped him cold. "I want to tell a story, a short one. It is an allegory. Do you know what an allegory is, Grant? Or is that one of those big words you think I don't understand?" I turned back to the audience. "There was once a man," I began, my tone conversational, almost pleasant. "He was a brilliant builder, or so he told everyone. He built a great tower, but the foundation was rotten. He had borrowed money from people he shouldn't have. He had made promises he couldn't keep, but he wasn't worried. Do you know why?" The room was deadly silent. Even the waiters had stopped moving. "He wasn't worried because he had a wife," I said, "and he thought his wife was an idiot. He thought she was just a decoration. He was so convinced of her stupidity that he would leave his blueprints out on the kitchen table. He would take calls from his creditors while she was pouring his coffee. He would discuss his fraudulent debts while she was sitting right next to him knitting baby clothes. He thought she was deaf to the language of money." I paused. I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. But the thing about money, I said, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, is that it speaks a universal language, and sometimes the wife isn't knitting. Sometimes she's taking notes. I saw a few of the wiser heads in the room. The seasoned bankers, the old-school investors exchanged glances. They knew this wasn't a toast. They knew this was a deposition. Darling stood up. Grant, she barked, forgetting her poise. Get her off the stage. She is hysterical. Grant lunged for the microphone. Okay, thank you. Mallory, that was very creative. Let's give her a hand, everyone. He tried to grab my arm. I stepped back smooth and quick. I have one question before I go. Grant, I said. I turned away from him. I turned toward the other side of the stage where Calder Voss was standing. The CEO of North Star Meridian had been watching me with an unreadable expression. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, perfectly still. Mr. Voss, I said, addressing him directly. Calder nodded. A micro-movement of respect. Mrs. Halloway, we are all here to celebrate the acquisition of Halloway Holdings by North Star Meridian for $8.4 billion. I said, a historic number, but I was reviewing the term sheet in the dressing room, specifically the final clause regarding the beneficial owner. Grant froze. His face went gray. He knew I shouldn't have seen that document. He knew that document was supposed to be locked in a briefcase in the VIP suite. The contract states, I continued, reciting the text from memory, that the final ratification of the merger requires the wet signature of the majority shareholder of the purchasing entity, the beneficial owner. I looked at Calder. Tell me, Mr. Voss, is the beneficial owner present tonight? Calder Voss did not look at Grant. He did not look at the audience. He looked directly at me. He stepped up to the microphone, his movement fluid and precise. Yes, Calder said. His voice was deep, authoritative, and carried the weight of absolute truth. The owner is standing right here on this stage. The air left the room for a second. Nobody moved. The audience looked between the three of us. Grant, sweating and manic, called her stoic and calm, and me, the pregnant wife in the black dress. Grant let out a laugh. It was a loud, desperate sound that cracked in the middle. Exactly. Grant shouted, throwing his arms out. Well, us, the new partnership, North Star and Halloway. We are the owners now. Calder has a way with words, doesn't he? Very dramatic. Grant turned to the audience, begging them to laugh with him. A few people chuckled nervously, but most did not. The tension was too thick. They could smell the blood in the water, even if they didn't know whose it was yet. Grant leaned in close to me, his voice a venomous whisper. You are embarrassing me. You are embarrassing yourself. Get off this stage before I have security drag you off. I looked at him. I looked at the man I had vowed to love, honor, and cherish. I saw the fear behind his eyes. He wasn't angry because I was embarrassing him. He was angry because deep down in the lizard brain that sensed danger, he knew the ground was shifting. I am not going anywhere, Grant. I whispered back. I am just getting started. I stepped away from the podium. I didn't walk toward the stairs. I walked toward the signing table. The table was set with blue velvet and the leather-bound ceremonial document. It was the altar where Grant intended to sacrifice my future to secure his own. Grant watched me go, confusion rippling across his face. Valerie, where are you going? The exit is that way. I ignored him. I reached the table. I placed my hand on the leather folder. It was a gesture of possession. It was a gesture of command. I looked out at the crowd one last time. I saw Darlene standing with her mouth slightly open. I saw Sloane, who had stopped drinking her wine. I saw the confused faces of the board members. I looked down at the document. And then, for the first time that night, I let myself feel the baby kick, a strong, distinctive thud against my ribs. We are ready, I thought. I opened the folder. The sound of the leather creasing was amplified by the microphone I was still wearing. It sounded like a thunderclap. I placed my hand firmly on the leather folder, trapping it between my palm and the velvet tablecloth. The friction of the leather against my skin felt like the first turn of a vault lock. Grant was staring at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and mounting fury. To the audience, it might have looked like a tender moment, a wife sharing a final whisper of encouragement with her husband before his big triumph. but the distance between us was charged with static electricity. I leaned in close, bringing my lips to his ear, ensuring that the lavalier microphone was angled just enough to miss my whisper but catch his reaction. "You cannot execute the final signature, Grant," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Not without my signature right next to it." Grant jerked back as if I had bitten him. He blinked rapidly, his confident mask slipping to reveal the panicked boy beneath. "What are you talking about?" he hissed, forgetting to smile for the cameras. "You are not on the board. You are not an officer. You are a housewife. Kick your hand off the contract." "I am not talking about the board," I replied. I reached into the slim, hidden pocket of my black architectural gown. I withdrew a single folded sheet of heavy cream paper. It was not a prop. It was a notarized certificate of beneficial ownership stamped with the seal of the Delaware Chancery Court and dated 7 years prior. I unfolded it with a sharp snap of my wrist and slid it across the blue velvet right over the ceremonial document he was so desperate to sign. "Read the header, Grant." Grant looked down. I watched his eyes scan the text. I watched the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin the color of old ash. He saw the trust name. He saw the entity structure. And then he saw the name listed as the sole beneficiary and controlling trustee, Mallory Ann Stonewell. "This is fake," he stammered, his voice trembling. He looked up at me, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. "You typed this up. You are trying to sabotage me." "It is notarized," I said, "and Calder Voss has the original. You are trying to sell a company to its owner, Grant, and I am not buying." Grant let out a strangled sound. He lunged forward, gripping my elbow with painful force, and practically dragged me away from the table, pulling me toward the shadowy alcove at the side of the stage, where the heavy velvet curtains bunched together. It was a blind spot hidden from the audience but visible to the wings. He cornered me there, his breathing ragged. "What game are you playing?" he demanded, shaking me slightly. "North Star is an institutional fund. It is not some piggy bank for a girl who used to wait tables." "Is there a problem?" Darlene appeared instantly, materializing like a specter. She had followed us, sensing the fracture in the performance. She squeezed into the small space with us, her eyes hard and glittering. She looked from Grant's pale face to the document I was still holding. "She is trying to blackmail us," Grant choked out, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She thinks she owns North Star." Darlene let out a sharp, derisive laugh. It was an ugly sound, stripped of all social graces. She stepped into my personal space, her perfume cloying and suffocating. "You really are pathetic," Darlene spat. "You are just a poor little girl we plucked from obscurity. We gave you a name, we gave you a life, and now you think you can stand here and pretend to be a player. You are nothing, Mallory. You are a uterus and a tax write-off. That is all you ever were." I looked at her. For years her words would have cut me. They would have made me feel small and unworthy. But tonight they just sounded like the desperate buzzing of a fly against a window pane. "You are right, Darlene," I said calmly. "I was the poor girl. I was the nobody. And because you were so obsessed with your own reflection, you never bothered to ask a single question about where I came from. You never ran a background check on my maiden name. You never asked who my grandmother was." I took a step forward, forcing Darlene to take a step back. "You assumed I was poor because I didn't wear logos," I said. "You assumed I was stupid because I listened instead of talking. And that arrogance is exactly why you are currently standing in a trap you built yourself." "Grant," Darlene snapped, losing her composure. "Call security. Get her out of here. She's having a mental break." "I can't," Grant whispered. He was looking at his phone. It had been vibrating incessantly in his pocket for the last 30 seconds. He pulled it out. The screen lit up his terrified face. "It is the custodial bank," Grant said, his voice sounding thin and watery. "They have paused the wire transfer." "Answer it," I ordered. Grant looked at me, then at the phone. He answered, putting it on speaker as he held it with a trembling hand. "This is Grant Halloway," he said. "Mr. Halloway." A crisp, professional voice came through the speaker. "This is the Fraud and Compliance Division at Sovereign Trust. We have received a red flag notification regarding the source of funds for the Halloway acquisition. The counterparty has flagged the transaction as unauthorized. But, Grant shouted, that is impossible. I am signing the deal right now. The instruction came from the controlling equity holder of North Star Meridian. The banker continued, his voice devoid of emotion. They have exercised their veto power under the Articles of Incorporation. The funds are frozen pending a federal audit of your collateral assets. Sir, are you aware that attempting to close this deal without beneficial owner consent is a federal crime? Grant dropped the hand holding the phone to his side. The line was still open. The banker asking, Mr. Halway, are you there? Grant looked at me. The realization was crashing down on him in waves. It wasn't just a failed deal. It was a criminal investigation. You, Grant whispered. You stopped the money. I own the money, Grant. I corrected him. North Star isn't buying you. I am not buying you. I blocked the deal because I do not acquire distressed assets with fraudulent books. Suddenly, Sloane pushed her way into our little circle. She had seen the commotion and, sensing that the spotlight was drifting away from her, decided to insert herself back into the narrative. She didn't know about the phone call. She didn't know about the trust. She only knew that I was getting too much attention. Oh, for heaven's sake, Sloane sneered, crossing her arms over her chest. Is this what this is about? Are you making up stories about companies and bank accounts because you are jealous? Look at you, Mallory. You are pathetic. You can't stand that he chose me. So, you are inventing a fantasy world where you are important. She reached out and touched Grant's arm, trying to reclaim him. Grant, baby, ignore her. She's just hormonal and jealous. I turned my gaze to Sloane. I looked at her with a kind of clinical pity. She was so confident in her position as the mistress, thinking she had won the prize. She didn't realize the prize was a grenade. Jealousy, I repeated, tasting the word. You think I am doing this because I want him? I laughed. It was a dry, genuine laugh. Sloane, I said, you think you are the winner here, but you are just another line item on a ledger you haven't read. You want to talk about reality. Let's talk about your employment contract. Sloane frowned. What are you talking about? I don't work for you. Grant hired you as a consultant through a shell company called Zenith Strategy, right? I asked. Zenith Strategy is a subsidiary of North Star Meridian. I acquired it 3 months ago when I was auditing Grant's vendor list. Sloane's mouth opened, but no sound came out. That means I am your boss, Sloane, I said, leaning in. And I had seen your expense reports, the hotel rooms, the flights, the dinners. You charge them all to the company account. That is embezzlement. So you can call it jealousy if you want. I call it cause for termination and potential prosecution. Sloane went pale. She dropped her hand from Grant's arm as if he were radioactive. Grant was shaking his head, looking between the three of us. The walls were closing in. The audience out in the ballroom was getting restless. The murmur of confusion was rising in volume. You can't do this, Grant pleaded, his voice cracking. Mallory, please. The investors are watching. If this deal falls through, the stock price crashes. I lose everything. The house, the cars, the reputation. Think about the baby. I am thinking about the baby, I said fiercely. That is why I am ensuring his inheritance isn't tied to a man who cooks the books. I took a step closer to him, lowering my voice to a lethal whisper. You thought I didn't understand money, Grant. You told your friends I was simple, but I understand money well enough to know the first rule of business. You cannot sell what you do not own. Grant slumped against the heavy velvet curtain. He looked defeated. He looked small. Darlene, however, was not done. She was a survivor, a viper who would strike even when her head was cut off. She saw Grant crumbling and decided to take matters into her own hands. She pulled her phone out and tapped a message furiously. You think you have one? Darlene hissed at me, her eyes manic. But I have an insurance policy, too. If we go down, you go down with us. Let's see how the board likes their new owner when they see what a hysterical, unhinged mess she really is. She looked toward the AV booth at the back of the room and nodded aggressively. What did you do? Grant asked, looking at his mother. I am ending this, Darlene said, a cruel smile twisting her lips. I told the tech team to run the tribute video, but I made a few edits. It shows exactly how unstable Mallory has been. The screaming, the crying, the fits. Once they see that, no one will believe a word she says about trusts or ownership. They will just see a crazy pregnant woman. I looked at Darlene. She truly believed she had the upper hand. She thought a few out-of-context clips of me dealing with pregnancy hormones would discredit a notarized legal document. But she had forgotten one thing. I had been in the dressing room for 20 minutes. I had my own tech team, and Darlene was using the hotel's Wi-Fi. Go ahead, Darlene, I said, stepping back out of the shadows and onto the edge of the stage. Play your movie. The house lights in the ballroom suddenly cut out, plunging the room into darkness. A hush fell over the crowd. Behind us, the massive LED screen that spanned the entire width of the stage flickered to life. Darlene smirked, crossing her arms, waiting for my humiliation to begin. She expected to see grainy footage of me crying. Instead, the screen blazed white, illuminating the terrified faces of the Holloway family. And then the first text message appeared. The massive LED screen behind us did not flicker with grainy footage of a hysterical pregnant woman. Instead, it blazed with a clarity that was almost blinding, projecting a high-definition interface that every person in the room recognized immediately. It was an iMessage thread. The font was 50 st high. The timestamp was from 3 weeks ago. The sender was listed clearly as Grant Holloway. The recipient was Sloan Mercer. A collective gasp sucked the oxygen out of the ballroom. It was a physical sound, like the air rushing out of a punctured tire. I watched the text scroll up on the screen, enormous and undeniable. Grant, she is leaving for her mother's place in Santa Fe on Friday. The house will be empty. Wear the red dress. I want to celebrate the pre-valuation numbers without the cow breathing down my neck. Sloan, I will be there by 8. Do you think she suspects anything about the accounts, Grant? She doesn't suspect a thing. She thinks a balance sheet is something you sleep on. We are safe. The brutality of the words hung over the room. I stood perfectly still on the edge of the stage, my face impassive. I could see the guests in the front row craning their necks, their mouths agape. They looked from the screen to Grant, then to me. The image of the beloved wife he had just praised was shattered by his own digital footprint. Grant stood frozen. He looked like a man who had been struck by lightning, but hadn't fallen yet. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Then the audio kicked in. It wasn't a text message this time. It was a voice note played through the ballroom's concert-grade sound system. The quality was crystal clear, capturing every inflection of the speaker's voice. There was no mistaking the sharp, aristocratic drawl of Darlene Holloway. Radio, listen to me, Sloan. We need a distraction during the gala. Something to get her out of the room before the signing ceremony. Spill your drink on her. Make it look like an accident. But aim for the stomach. It needs to be messy enough that she has to leave to change, and make sure the photographer catches it. I want a photo of her looking like a disaster to leak to the press later. The recording ended with a sharp click. The reaction was instantaneous. A sound of pure revulsion rippled through the crowd. A sharp hiss that turned into a low, angry rumble. Darlene's hand flew to her throat. She looked at the speakers as if they were possessed demons. For the first time in her life, she had lost control of the narrative. The woman who prided herself on social grace had just been exposed as the architect of a public assault on her own grandchild. Sloan backed away from Darlene, her eyes wide with terror. She looked at the crowd and saw their judgment. She wasn't the glamorous future Mrs. Holloway anymore. She was the hired gun. She was the thug in the red dress. But I wasn't done. I tapped the screen of my phone. At that exact second, a new sound filled the room. It was the sound of 500 smartphones vibrating at once against wood tables and inside suit pockets. It sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. Every guest, every investor, and every journalist in the room simultaneously received a priority email notification. I brought the microphone to my lips. I have just sent a link to the data room to everyone present, I announced. My voice cut through the murmur like a knife. The file contains the unredacted financial records of Holloway Holdings for the last 5 years. It includes the offshore accounts Grant used to hide $300 million in debt. It includes the invoices for the fake user acquisition campaigns, and it includes the emails between Darlene Holloway and Sloan Mercer plotting to manipulate the stock price. I paused, looking out at the sea of glowing screens as people frantically checked their phones. To protect yourselves from legal liability, I added calmly, I suggest you read it before you consider investing a single cent. Pandemonium broke out. Bankers were scrolling through PDFs, their faces turning pale. Journalists were typing furiously, breaking the story in real time. The carefully curated illusion of the Holloway empire was disintegrating into pixels and databs right before our eyes. Grant snapped. He lunged for the podium, grabbing the microphone stand so hard it rattled. "This is a lie," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "This is fake. It is AI. She generated this. She is trying to frame me. None of this is real." He pointed a shaking finger at the screen. "Turn it off. Someone cut the power. It is a deep fake." Grant looked desperate, sweat pouring down his face, his tuxedo disheveled. He looked guilty. But in the age of technology, denial is a powerful drug. A few people in the crowd hesitated, looking up from their phones. Could it be fake? Was the pregnant wife capable of such a sophisticated fabrication? Then Caldervos stepped forward. He moved with the slow, deliberate weight of an executioner. He took the microphone from Grant's trembling hand. He didn't fight for it. He simply took it. And Grant was too weak to stop him. Calder looked out at the audience. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was far worse. "I have my own forensic team monitoring the data stream," Calder said. His deep voice boomed, settling the room. "We have verified the metadata on every single message and document. The timestamps match the carrier logs. The IP addresses match the devices registered to Grant Holloway and Darlene Holloway. This data is authentic. The North Star due diligence team confirms it." That was the nail in the coffin. Caldervos was the gold standard. If he said it was real, it was real. Grant staggered back. He looked at Calder, betrayed. "You were supposed to be my partner. I am the CEO of a company owned by your wife." Calder replied coldly, "My loyalty is to the shareholder, not the target," as if on cue. Movement flared at the edge of the stage. A woman walked up the stairs. She was dressed in a sharp white suit that looked like it could cut glass. She carried a thick red legal folder. It was Tesser Hart. Tesser didn't look at the crowd. She walked straight to Grant. She didn't offer a handshake. She thrust a stack of papers against his chest. "Grant Holloway," Tesser announced, her voice projected clearly without a microphone. "You are hereby served with a petition for divorce. You are also served with an emergency temporary restraining order, freezing your access to all marital assets and company accounts pending a forensic audit." Grant clutched the papers instinctively. He stared at them, his eyes losing focus. Tesser turned to Sloan. Sloan shrank back, trying to hide behind a floral arrangement. "MS. Mercer," Tesser said, extending another envelope. "This is a notice of a civil suit for alienation of affection and conspiracy to defraud. We are also filing a motion to depose you regarding your role in the falsification of the Holloway Holdings revenue reports. I suggest you get a lawyer, a very expensive one." Sloan let out a sob. She looked at Grant, waiting for him to save her. But Grant wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ruined term sheet on the table. Finally, Tesser turned to Darlene. Darlene was standing rigid, her face a mask of fury. She tried to rally. She tried to channel 50 years of social dominance into one last stand. "This is entrapment," Darlene shrieked, pointing at me. "She planned this. She set us up. You saw the video. She is the one who is unstable. She is trying to destroy this family." Darlene looked to the crowd for support. "She is a gold digger. She lied about who she was. She is the villain here." But the crowd stared back at her with cold, dead eyes. They had heard the voice note. They had seen the texts. They knew exactly who the villain was. Darlene Harling was not a victim. She was a monster in velvet. The social capital she had hoarded for decades evaporated in seconds. I saw the wives of the board members, women Darlene had bullied for years, whispering to each other, their faces hard. Darlene was done. I stepped forward. I stood center stage, flanked by the wreckage of my marriage. I looked at Darlene. Then I looked at Grant. "You think I did this because of the wine?" I said. The room went quiet again to hear me. You think I did this because you embarrassed me? I continued. But you are wrong. I can handle a stain on a dress. I can handle a mother-in-law who hates me. I can even handle a husband who cheats. I placed a hand on my stomach. But what I cannot handle, I said, my voice dropping to a register that sent a chill through the front row, is being treated like I do not have a voice. You thought you could silence me. You thought you could erase me. You thought I was just a prop in your story. I paused, letting the words land. I am not answering you tonight because I am angry. I said I am answering you because for 5 years you thought I didn't have the right to speak. Well, I am speaking now, and I'm telling you that the Holloway name is no longer yours to sell. Grant looked at me. His eyes were wild, darting from the screen to the audience to the legal papers in his hand. He looked like a trapped animal realizing the cage was locked. Suddenly, a look of desperate manic clarity crossed his face. The suite, he muttered. He looked at the signing table. The ceremonial document was useless. But he remembered something. He remembered the draft copy in the VIP suite upstairs, the copy he had signed earlier, the copy that in his diluted mind might still be valid if he could just get a witness to countersign it before the official freeze order hit the bank servers. He thought he could outrun the digital lockout. I can still fix this, Grant whispered. He dropped the microphone. He didn't work. He ran. Grant bolted from the stage, scrambling down the side stairs, nearly tripping over a cable. He sprinted up the aisle, pushing past confused waiters and shocked guests. He was heading for the elevators. He was heading for the suite. He is going for the backup contracts, Calder said quietly, stepping up beside me. I know, I said. I didn't run. I didn't scramble. I simply turned and walked toward the stairs. Mallory, Tesser said, reaching out a hand. Let security handle him. No, I said, lifting the hem of my black architectural gown so I could move freely. He needs to hear the end of the story. I walked down the stairs and followed my husband. I moved with the inevitability of a tide. He was running to a room where he thought he had power. He didn't realize he was running to a room where the locks had already been changed. I followed him into the corridor, my heels clicking a steady, relentless rhythm on the marble floor. I wasn't just chasing a man. I was chasing down the ghost of the woman I used to be to make sure she never came back. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was suffocatingly silent. I watched the numbers tick up on the display, 234, while Calder Voss and Tesser Hart stood behind me like a Taurian guard. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. The adrenaline was no longer a rush. It was a cold, steady hum in my veins. When the door slid open, I could already hear shouting coming from the executive suite at the end of the hall. Grant had sprinted ahead, desperate to outrun the truth. He was trying to physically force a reality that had already been dismantled digitally. I walked toward the open double doors of the suite. Inside, the scene was chaotic. Around the large mahogany conference table sat 3 men and 1 woman, the senior partners from the investment bank and the external legal counsel for Holloway Holdings. They looked startled, their coffees halfway to their mouths as Grant stood over them, heaving for breath, his tuxedo jacket torn at the shoulder seam. Give me the pen, Grant was shouting, slamming his hand on the table. We need to countersign the hard copies now. The digital system is down. It is a glitch. We have to lock this in before the market opens in Tokyo. Mr. Henderson, the lead banker, looked at Grant with deep concern. Mr. Holloway, we cannot sign anything if the system is flagging a compliance hold. We need to wait for the verification. Screw the verification, Grant Rod, grabbing a fountain pen from the center tray. He flipped the heavy document open to the signature page. I am the CEO. My signature is the verification. Witness this. Just witness it. He pressed the nib to the paper. Do not let that ink touch the page, I said. My voice was not loud, but it stopped the room cold. I stepped through the doorway. Flanking the table, Grant froze, the pen hovering millimeters above the signature line. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wild. You, he spat. Get out. This is a closed meeting. I walked to the head of the table. I placed the black leather folder I had carried from the stage directly onto the document Grant was trying to sign. I am the beneficial owner of North Star Meridian, I stated, looking at Mr. Henderson, and I am explicitly revoking the authority for this transaction. If Mr. Holloway signs that document, he is committing forgery." Mr. Henderson stood up slowly. He looked from Grant to me, then to Calder Voss, who had just entered the room behind me. "Mr. Us," Henderson asked, his voice shaking slightly, "is this true? We were under the impression the ownership structure was blind." Calder stepped forward. He didn't look at Grant. He opened a slim briefcase and extracted a single document with a gold seal. "It was blind," Calder said, sliding the paper across the mahogany surface. "Until tonight. This is the certificate of incumbency authenticated by the Delaware Chancery Court this morning. It lists the sole controlling member of the trust that owns North Star Meridian." Anderson picked up the paper. He adjusted his glasses. He read the name. He looked at me. Then he looked at Grant with a mixture of pity and professional horror. "It is her," Henderson said quietly. "Lallery Ann Stonewell. She holds 100% of the voting rights." Grant dropped the pen. It rolled across the table and fell to the floor with a soft clatter. "No," Grant whispered, shaking his head. "No, that is impossible. You are lying. You are all lying." He turned to me, his face twisting into a mask of ugly desperation. He took a step toward me, his hands curling into fists. "You are insane," he screamed. "You are doing this out of spite. You are going to ruin me. You are going to destroy $1 billion company just because I slept with someone else. You are going to burn my career to the ground." I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. "I am not burning your career, Grant," I said, my voice steady. "I am just turning on the lights. You destroyed your career when you cooked the books. You destroyed it when you fabricated 400,000 active users. You destroyed it when you hid $300 million of debt in a shell company in the Caymans. I did what I had to do," Grant yelled, "to save the company, to save us. I did it for the family. You did it for your ego." I corrected him. "And you sold a fraudulent asset to a company I own. That is not business, Grant. That is theft." Tesser Hart stepped forward. Then she opened a red legal file. The sound of the paper rustling was sharp in the sudden silence. "Mr. Holloway," Tesser said, her tone clinical, "I have just filed a formal complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding the irregularities in the Holloway Holdings valuation. We have also filed a motion for the preservation of all digital and physical evidence." She placed a document on the table next to the unsigned contract. "This is a copy of the preservation order," Tesser continued. "It means that if you delete one email, if you shred one piece of paper, or if you attempt to access the server room, you will be held in contempt of court and immediately remanded into custody." Grant stared at the paper. He looked like he was going to be sick. Suddenly, a noise at the door made us all turn. Sloane Mercer stood in the doorway. She looked wrecked. Her red dress was disheveled, her makeup smeared. She was breathing hard, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. She looked at Grant, then at the bankers, and finally at me. She realized the power dynamic had shifted permanently. Grant was not the king anymore. He was the sacrifice, and Sloane had no intention of burning on the P with him. "Slow," Grant said, his voice pleading. Tell them we acted in good faith." Sloane didn't look at him. She walked into the room, her movements jerky and nervous. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small silver USB drive. "He promised me the VP of Marketing position," Sloane said, her voice trembling. She looked at Mr. Henderson. "He told me that if I helped him manage the optics tonight, I would have a seat on the board. He said North Star was a done deal." "Sloane, shut up," Grant shouted, lunging toward her. Calder Voss moved faster than a man of his age should have been able to. He stepped between Grant and Sloane, using his shoulder to block Grant's path. Grant bounced off him, stumbling back against the wall. Sloane didn't stop. She tossed the USB drive onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of the horrified bankers. "I am not going to jail for him," Sloane said, tears finally spilling over. "That drive contains the original audio files from the strategy meetings. It proves he knew the user numbers were fake." And she choked back a sob. "It has the recording where he told me to pour the wine. He said if I humiliated Mallory, she would leave the building and he could sign the deal without her interference. The room went deadly silent. The bankers recoiled from the USB drive as if it were a poisonous snake. Grant looked at Sloane with pure hatred. "You traitorous little. You used me." Sloane screamed back. "You said I was the love of your life, but I was just another prop, wasn't I? Just like the wine, just like her, Grant." The voice came from the hallway. Darlene Holloway appeared. She had run all the way from the ballroom, her velvet gown trailing behind her, her face a map of panic. She stopped at the door, taking in the scene. The banker standing up, the legal papers, the USB drive on the table. She looked at the USB drive. She recognized it. It was the one Sloane kept on her keychain. Darlene's eyes widened. She knew exactly what was on that drive. Her own voice was on that drive. "Oh no," Darlene whispered. She put a hand to the doorframe to steady herself. "Sloane, you stupid girl. What did you do?" "I saved myself," Darlene. Sloane snapped. "Something you should have taught your son to do before he committed fraud." Darlene looked at me. For the first time, there was no arrogance in her eyes. There was only fear. She realized that the poor girl she had mocked had just outmaneuvered 3 generations of Holloway cunning in a single night. "Mallory," Darlene said, her voice shaking, "we can fix this. We can talk. We are family. The baby—" "Don't," I said. "Do not mention my child." Before Darlene could speak again, the sound of heavy footsteps coming down the corridor silenced the room. 2 men in dark suits appeared at the door. They were not hotel security. They were not local police. They had the distinct, nondescript look of federal agents who specialized in white-collar crime. Behind them were 2 uniformed officers. The lead agent, a man with a square jaw and tired eyes, stepped into the room. He held up a badge. "We are from the Department of Justice, Financial Crimes Division," he announced. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "We are executing an emergency freeze order on the assets of Holloway Holdings and all associated entities." He looked around the room. "Who is Grant Holloway?" Grant didn't answer. He was pressed against the wall, looking like he wanted to melt into the wallpaper. "That is him," Tesser Hart said, pointing a manicured finger. The agent nodded. He walked over to Grant. He didn't pull out handcuffs. Not yet. He simply handed Grant a piece of paper. "Mr. Holloway, you are hereby served with a subpoena to surrender all electronic devices and travel documents immediately. You are considered a flight risk. Do not leave the jurisdiction." Grant took the paper. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The agent turned to Darlene. "Mrs. Darlene Holloway." Darlene stiffened. "I am just an observer. Your name is listed as a co-signatory on the shell accounts referenced in the whistleblower complaint." The agent said, "We will need your devices as well." Darlene looked like she had been slapped. She clutched her purse, looking at Grant, then at Sloane, then at the floor. The agent then turned to the table. He looked at the documents. He looked at the unsigned contract. Finally, he looked at me. "We need to verify the chain of command for the purchasing entity to ensure no funds have already been transferred." The agent said, "We have the paperwork here, but I need a verbal confirmation for the record." He looked at his clipboard, then up at me. "Are you Mallory Stonewall?" "I am," I said. "And do you confirm before these witnesses that you are the sole controlling party of Northstar Meridian and that you did not authorize this merger?" The room waited. This was the final nail. This was the sentence. I turned slowly. I looked at Grant. He was slumped against the wall, holding the subpoena, looking at me with eyes that were begging for mercy. He wanted me to save him. He wanted the wife who fixed his mistakes to step in one last time. I looked at Darlene, who was trembling in her velvet gown. I looked at Sloane, who was weeping silently over her ruined ambitions. Then I looked back at Grant. I smiled. It was the same smile I used to give him when he told me I didn't understand business. Soft, patient, except this time it was fatal. "I confirm," I said clearly. "I am the owner, and I did not authorize this deal." Grant closed his eyes and let his head hit the wall with a thud. "Thank you, ma'am," the agent said. "We will take it from here." I reached out and took the black leather folder from the table. I didn't look back. I walked toward the door, past Arling, past the agents, and out into the hallway. The air in the corridor was cool. I took a deep breath. My hand rested on my stomach. The baby kicked again. It was done. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The federal agents lowered their clipboards, their jobs suddenly simplified by my confession. The bankers looked at me with a newfound, terrifying respect, but it was Grant who looked as though he had been physically struck. He slumped against the wall, his face draining of the last vestiges of color, leaving him looking gray and old. Thanked you so much for listening to this story of betrayal and justice. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So, please leave a comment down below and share your thoughts on Mallory's Revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story get heard by even more people. Thanks for watching.